Whenever election season rolls around, we are just bombarded with numbers, right? Polls telling us who's up, who's down, and who's got a real shot. But how do they actually work? And maybe more importantly, can we even trust them? Today, we're going to decode the polls and find out.
And that's a huge question, you know? It really gets to the very heart of what democracy is all about. I mean, think about it. How can our leaders possibly represent us if they don't know what we, the people, actually want?
Okay, so for this whole system of representative democracy to actually function, two things are absolutely essential. First, we, the voters, we have to have preferences and opinions. And second, our elected officials need to hear those opinions and, ideally act on them. But that second part, how do they hear us?
Historically, trying to figure out what the public actually thought, man, it was a total mess. Leaders basically had to rely on a few methods that seemed to make sense, but as we're about to see, every single one had some pretty serious flaws.
So the early attempts, they were intuitive. Direct communication, emails, phone calls, that seems obvious. But that really only captures the voices of the most fired up, motivated people. Elections, they're a massive check on power, for sure, but one single vote can't possibly communicate how you feel about dozens of different issues. And focus groups, yeah, they can be helpful, but they're just way too small to represent millions of people.
So all these problems, they basically cried out for a better way to do things. Something more rigorous, more accurate, more scientific. And this brings us to the hero of our story, the modern public opinion poll.
The solution, when you think about it, is actually pretty brilliant. Instead of trying to do the impossible, asking everybody what they think, you just ask a much smaller, carefully selected group a set of well-crafted questions. And that, in a nutshell, is a scientific poll.
So the first absolutely crucial ingredient here is random selection. For a poll to be legit, every single person in the group you're studying, say all American adults, has to have an equal chance of being picked. It's the bedrock of fairness.
And that randomness is what gets you to the second key ingredient, a representative sample. I love this analogy. Think of it like a giant pot of soup. You don't have to eat the whole thing to know if it needs more salt, right? You just need one well-stirred spoonful. That spoonful is your representative sample. It has the same mix of carrots, celery, and chicken, or, demographics, as the entire pot.
So how big does that spoonful need to be? Well, the answer is probably going to surprise you. For a massive national poll that's trying to figure out the opinions of over 330 million Americans, pollsters usually only need to talk to about 1,500 people. That's it.
Now, of course, it's not going to be perfect. And that's where something called the margin of error comes in. A typical poll might have a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. Just think of it as a built-in fudge factor. It means the pollsters are 95% confident that the true opinion of the entire country is somewhere inside that 6-point window.
Okay, so now that we've got the how these polls are actually built, let's dive into the why. Now that you have this powerful tool, you can use it in all sorts of strategic ways, especially in the world of politics.
You see, campaigns use different polls for different jobs. A benchmark poll is kind of like taking the temperature at the very start of a race. It tells a candidate where they stand and what issues voters really care about. Tracking polls are run over and over to see how support is changing day to day. And then you have exit polls, where people are surveyed right after they vote to help news organizations figure out why the election turned out the way it did.
But here's where it gets really tricky. Because even with the best science, polling has a weak spot. And it's a big one. The way you ask a question can totally change the answer you get back, sometimes on purpose.
I mean, really, how much of a difference can just a few little words make? Well, it turns out a ton. Let's look at this incredible real-world example from a 2003 Pew Research Center poll. This is fascinating.
Okay, so researchers asked one group of people this pretty straightforward question. Should we take military action to get a specific result? The answers seemed pretty clear. But then they asked another group a slightly different version.
See that? They added just one clause, but it changes everything. It introduces the potential cost, the human cost of that military action. The goal is the same, but suddenly the stakes feel way, way higher.
And the result? Whoa. It was absolutely staggering. Support for military action plummeted from 68% all the way down to 43%. That is a 25-point drop just from adding one phrase that framed the consequences. It's a powerful reminder that how you ask is just as important as what you ask.
And believe me, question wording isn't the only tripe you gotta watch for. The order of questions can prime somebody to think a certain way. And then you have these slimy things called push polls, which are basically just negative attack ads disguised as a survey. And you should always be skeptical of those online or call-in polls where anybody can vote. They aren't random, so they just aren't reliable.
So all of this, it leads us to the big one. If polling is a science, how can it get things so spectacularly wrong sometimes? Well, for that, there's no better case study than the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
I'm sure you remember this. Almost every major national poll leading up to Election Day was predicting a victory for Hillary Clinton. So when Donald Trump won, a lot of people just threw their hands up and said, see, polling is broken. But the real story, well, it's a little more complicated than that.
As the famous statistician Nate Silver pointed out, it wasn't that the polls showed it was impossible for Trump to win, it was just unlikely. He gave Trump about a 1 in 3 chance of winning. Think about that. That's the same as rolling a die and having it come up a 1 or 2. It happens. It's far from a 0% chance.
So what was really going on? Well, a few things. First, it's incredibly hard for pollsters to predict who is actually going to show up and vote versus who stays home. Second, some groups of voters who heavily favored Trump were just less likely to answer a pollster's call, and that can skew the sample. And finally, there's this thing called the shy voter effect, where some people might just be reluctant to admit to a stranger on the phone that they're supporting a controversial candidate.
And really, that's the big takeaway here. Polling gives us this incredibly valuable snapshot of public opinion. It's a powerful tool, it's based on real scientific principles, but it's also done in a messy, complex, human world. And that means it is never going to be perfect.
Which leaves us with one final, really important thought. We know polls have their flaws, we've seen them. But if we didn't have them, what's the alternative? Whose voices would our leaders actually listen to? Would it only be the loudest voices, the wealthiest ones? Imperfect as it is, scientific polling might just be the best tool we've got to hear the true voice of the people.